Imagine you need routine health care, and imagine it's more difficult than you think. Imagine that you're in need, you're at your most vulnerable and you need help, and your doctor doesn't know what to do with you. This is the reality for transgender people each day. And through my research, I've learned that the prevalence of transgender people is probably higher than you and I think. I've also learned that transgendered healthcare is primary healthcare and not specialized healthcare. But the reality is, every day, the healthcare needs of transgender people go unmet due to stigma, discrimination, lack of practitioner knowledge, and lack of education. We have strived in this country to make our healthcare system equitable, and in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to share with you why this work is so important to me as a social worker. In the next 10 minutes, I ask you to consider what you can do to improve access to care for transgender people, improve practitioner knowledge, and improve education for all in order to make the lives of trans people better. As Karl Marx said, the philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. I started this journey in this field over 2 decades ago, and I started working in lesbian and gay organizing, and at that time, my transgendered friends walked courageously alongside me, fighting for things like gay marriage. But like mainstream society, I would argue transgendered people stood outside of mainstream lesbian and gay lives. It was not until I started working in Toronto in a women's shelter that I began a greater appreciation of what it might be to be transgendered in our world. That shelter was one of very few that housed transgendered people at the time, and it was one of very few that had a transgender positive policy at the time. You need to know that I've had a very privileged life. I have 2 graduate degrees. I've had excellent jobs. My coming out story was not problematic. My parents never kicked me out of the house. My parents didn't disapprove of the choices I made. But I have faced homophobia, and I have faced racism. And those things have impacted my sense of community, my employability, and often the way I've been treated. But I would argue my trans friends don't even have it as easy as me. And as a cisgendered person or somebody who's comfortable in the gender and sex I've been given at birth, I can only begin to appreciate what it might be like to be transgendered in our world. So I felt it was my responsibility, the onus was on me, to begin to educate myself about transgendered life, non-binary life. I want to share with you the story of Justin. Justin was in his 20s when he transitioned, and Justin actually grew up in a lesbian household in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Now, I would have thought, because Justin grew up in a lesbian household, that Justin wouldn't have been inundated with transphobia. But in fact, his parents were so angry at the thought of Justin transitioning to his true self, his male self, that Justin had to move to Toronto. Justin's story is a success story, however. Justin's gone on to do postgraduate work at a university not far from here, and has devoted his life and his research to transgendered work. But this isn't the case for everyone. As one of the research participants said, friends of mine in the trans community looking for hormones specifically are being turned away because the doctor does not have the experience of working with transgendered people. So we know firsthand that healthcare practitioners do not know how to adequately or appropriately manage the healthcare needs of trans people. I was also in this boat as a registered social worker and lesbian. The assumption was made that because I was a lesbian and identified as queer, that I could appreciate what a transgender person might be experiencing, that I could help them meet their needs. Wrong. I had to learn, be open, and be flexible just like anyone else. We know that as many as 1,400 people identify as trans in North Simcoe Muskoka, 1,400 people. And we know that this number will, in fact, exponentially grow if we consider the very young. The Simcoe County District School Board Climate Study estimated that, in fact, 9% of our student population identifies as LGBTQ. We estimate in our research that trans people might be, in fact, 2% of our population. Trans people are living with multiple health concerns, primarily mental health concerns, chronic pain, physical or mobility issues, and chronic illness. I also had clients coming to me, sometimes on a daily basis, complaining of the pain that they were in. And this pain would be both mental and physical in character. But when we examined them, we'd find nothing wrong. This pain was, in fact, the manifestation of depression, anxiety, fear, a deep sense of hurt, and a deep sense of isolation. We know that 80% of those surveyed experienced suicidal thoughts, and 56% experienced suicidal thoughts in the last 12 months. 44% of our trans community has attempted suicide. 44%. That's deplorable. The Trans Pulse study, which was a community-based project out of the University of Toronto, found that past year suicide attempts were 27% in those who wanted to undergo a medical transition but weren't able to because they couldn't find a practitioner who was willing to assist them, and they couldn't do so in a timely way. Past year suicide attempts decreased to 1%. 1% in trans people who, by their own definition, had completed a medical transition. When you hear this kind of evidence, it's a no-brainer. Who wouldn't want to help? Whether the person is 12 or 50 years old, we know that when they've been heard, when they know there's a plan in place, they do better. Don't we all deserve this? There are a number of social factors that also impact trans people. Unemployment, housing discrimination, avoidance of public spaces, particularly if somebody feels they're not passing that day, and the avoidance of the healthcare system due to stigma and discrimination. As a marginalized person myself, when these things have happened to me, I tend to shield myself, protect myself from them not happening again. I'll revert back to the closet if I have to. But when you're talking about somebody's gender and somebody's race, these are things that you can't closet. These are things that you can't deny. Access to hormone therapy is still time restricted, involves a considerable amount of legwork, and is unnecessarily complicated. The informed consent model is the best practice model for trans healthcare. Now, we in fact practice the informed consent model each day in our healthcare system. So if you come into your healthcare team and you're diabetic, your healthcare team's going to walk you through the array of treatment options available to you, and through that knowledge, through that informed consent, you're going to make a choice about which of those treatment options works best for you. All we're asking is the same for transgender people, to be provided informed consent around hormone therapy. The other thing that needs to happen is hormone therapies need to be monitored. 27% of those in our survey were being monitored by a primary care physician, and 54% were being monitored by some other practitioner. 15% were not being monitored at all. We know that trans people during a health encounter are experiencing an exorbitant amount of transphobia. They're left in this balancing act of being an advocate for themselves on one hand and being an expert about their health care on the other. Why? Because health practitioners don't have that expertise. And this awkward balancing act creates a challenge for them, and they're left wanting. Meaning they're trying to be an advocate expert on one hand and trying to get some sort of health care, even maybe respectable health care, on the other hand. When trans people did identify that they had a positive health experience, they described it as feeling lucky. Can you imagine? I can only imagine on multiple levels how challenging this must be. To be an advocate expert on one hand, and then to be trying to get some sort of health care on the other. And I can only imagine that imbalance is intensified if I'm experiencing any sort of crisis at the time, particularly psychological. When I met Carrie, she was in her 20s. And I met her working as the manager of Canada's only women's housing for women with HIV. Carrie had lived on the streets for most of her life. Carrie had, in fact, had top surgery after a long-standing John agreed to pay for it. And Carrie dreamed about going to Thailand to have bottom surgery when she could afford it. Carrie was also addicted to crack cocaine. And through this process of living on the street and buying her hormones on the street and buying her crack on the street, when her drug habit won, Carrie wasn't able to buy her hormones. And so when I met Carrie, her hormones hadn't been monitored for a considerable amount of time, and she was broken, both emotionally and behaviorally. Now, I've often dreamed about what Carrie's life might be like if things were different in her world at that time. Trans people are our daughters, our sons, our moms, and our dads. Yet we don't allow them to walk amongst us. What I know is that fear and difference has an incredible way of making us mistreat each other. When I interviewed Emily, she said, "I have good health care, but it's not here in Simcoe County because it's not good here. I have to go elsewhere." We know that trans people are traveling far for their health care. And what we also know is that trans people actually want to be able to transition in place. They want to transition at home, in their hometown. Why? Because we know that when people receive their health care as close to home as possible, they do better. They recover quicker. What would truly make me happy is if my trans friends didn't have to travel for care. If their health care was truly accessible, knowledgeable, and respectful. I leave you with this one last story. And this story has had a profound impact on me and my life choices. I learned this story from Deepak Chopra, and it goes like this. Each time I breathe in and I exhale pieces of myself, cells of myself, that you then inhale. And through this process, my cells travel around the earth in one day. And because I inhale each one of you each day, I owe it to you to create a world of respect, equity, and love. We are all meant to be equal. And in order to elevate our communities, we need to transform from within. Thank you.